Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be discussing perspectives on sexuality. To open up this chapter, we're going to introduce our main theoretical perspective that we're going to apply, which is going to be a biopsychosocial approach to studying human sexuality. But just as a general introduction, the book discusses the idea of sexual intelligence, which is an interesting way to start. But again, what is it going to take for us as a class to be able to scientifically study human behavior and cognitions, emotions, the social context, biological process involved in sexuality, and then to look at levels of sexual behavior, levels of understanding, and again, it can be very complex because one, humans engage in so much diverse sexual behavior that to keep up in all of it is just very complicated. I put the picture on the right because I thought it was a little bit fun. I was actually teaching this in another psychology class the other day, but this is really interesting because then I started thinking about how do you apply the eight intelligence to sexuality, and bodily kinesthetic could be like, your ability to physically perform, interpersonal, your ability to interact with other people and find partners, for example, verbal linguistic, which plays into your interpersonal skills, and also having fun and, using fun pickup lines or whatever it might be. I'm just joking. I don't think I've ever even used a pickup line in my life. Maybe I have. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. Not for this class to discuss, of course. Um, but then again, logical mathematical, like looking at the Kama Sutra and asking yourself, what are all the multiple positions that could be engaged in, and how do I better approach this and use my bodily kinesthetic skills to be able to have mad skills, for example. Naturalistic, your ability just to roll with the flow and just kind of observe and take it all in, and being intrapersonal, like being cool and comfortable with yourself, being confident, not being insecure, visual spatial, being able to use those objects in the social world to get what you want. And I really put that up there just for a little bit of jest. But again, just to get you guys thinking that when we're talking about sexual intelligence, we can be talking about individuals and their ability to engage in sexuality, or a scientific or us as scientists in our ability to understand sexuality, or just people in general on being able to simply understand their own sexuality. And so your book introduces the idea of self-understanding of our, sexuality, being aware of the biopsychosocial processes that are occurring, being comfortable discussing it with yourself and others, things along those lines. Focusing on interpersonal skills, your book talks about like what happens when you're in a relationship. Are you comfortable talking about sex and sexuality? Or are you, hampered by cultural norms that say it's a taboo to talk about things sexual, for example? And then again, our scientific knowledge, which is what we're going to be really focusing on in this class, is taking our theoretical biopsychosocial approach and then looking at that and seeing if it holds up in the social context. Is our biological processes, up, do they play a role in us seeking out sexuality, engaging in sexuality, thinking about sexuality? And again, your book talks about the nervous system, for example. And again, you have two ways that your brain communicates, right? You have the nervous system, then you have the endocrine system, and the endocrine system releases chemicals into your bloodstream to talk to your brain to tell you you're hungry or you want sex or you're cold and go find shelter or whatever it might be. And then your nervous system is talking to itself and it's talking to your body. And all of it is, are they all just thinking about sex all the time? Your body and the mind? That's the old joke, right? That the media presents. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, in this class, that's what we need to be focusing on, right? What are these biological processes and how do they influence sexual behavior? And then the psychology of it all. How does the body influence the brain and the social context influence the brain? And then going on in the brain, we have our emotions, cognitions, motivations, all of these psychological processes, perceptions, conscious decisions, unconscious decisions. And then in the social context, you have agents of socialization that are socializing you into a cultural way of life that includes the norms about what's acceptable and what's not when it comes to sexual behavior. And so, if you think about your interpersonal skills, for example, how is your ability to talk about sex structured by cultural attitudes about what's cool to talk about and what's not, for example. And so again, this idea of considering the social and cultural, I put social slash cultural. The social context essentially is everything outside of our heads that is, human, and then you have the environment, which could include all the nature. And then when you're talking about culture, you're really talking about that common way of life of the group or the society in which you belong to. Okay. And so we're always asking, how does the social context structure our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings, our attitudes, things along those lines about sexuality? Okay. So again, this biopsychosocial orientation. When you're talking biology, you're asking how do our hormones, gonads, genitalia, chromosomes influence our cognitions, emotions, motivations, and then behavior. Okay? The psychological approach is thinking about those things that I just listed, your cognitions, your emotions, motivations, arousal, perception, attitudes, things going on in your head. And then that social context, you're looking at culture, the way of life, agents of socialization. Who are the people that are teaching you stuff and what are they teaching you? Because they're the ones who are teaching you the cultural norms, for example. And so when you talk about personality theory, right, you have like the I and the me, or the id, the ego, and the superego, or this idea that you have your inner self and your social self. And again, our social self, the part of us that we express out here in the social context, is highly structured by the cultural attitudes and expectations and agents of socialization and those who have the power to socially control us. So, your social self and your inner self don't always mesh, right? We all kind of put on a performance out here in the social context, and we often hide parts of our true self, for example, or we hold back parts of ourself, like our desires, And relating to like sexuality, for example, like when you go to meet someone that you're attracted to, right? You can't just walk up to that person and be like, I'm so attracted to you right now. The proper dating script or whatever that might be that's culturally dictated would say you have to, one, introduce yourself, try to get to know them a bit, don't think about sex for a minute, try to get to know them as a person before you just jump out and say, I love you on the first day, okay? So again, that's just a play on that we're going to be talking about throughout this entire class. This biopsychosocial approach. You have all of these different influences coming from multiple directions, the body, the mind, and the social context that are associated with the way we behave, the way we think. Okay? Real quick, we need to have a stopgap here and get some of our vocabulary worked out. So when we're talking about biological sex versus gender versus sexuality. Biological sex is going to be talking about those hormones, gonads, genitalia, chromosomes that we can categorize in such a way that we can then label someone as male, female, or intersex. Gender is supposed to be your perception of what socially constructed category you belong to, but throughout this class, we're always going to ask, how does our biology influence our identification with socially constructed categories that we label as genders? And then when we're talking about sexuality, we're going to be talking about the arousal, physical processes, sexually influenced cognitions and behaviors. Um, and then when we're looking at sexual orientation, we're going to be talking about identification with culturally constructed or socially constructed categories that don't exist in nature. So gender categories and sexual orientation categories and biological sex categories even are all real social constructions. Like all of us have blends of testosterone and estrogen that doesn't always completely match up. Like there are females that have tons of testosterone, but yet they have breasts, ovaries, and a penis. Then there are people that have been thought they were men their whole lives that have a penis, but it turns out they also have ovaries, at the same time. So, because humans can be born with a penis and ovaries. There are people that have identified as female that have two vaginas and have babies. And if you look up intersex and you study the range between male and female, and you're going to find that there's quite a large blend, and that humans come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors with divergent organs, even. It's an incredible science. Please do a little investigative research. It gets complicated when you get into the genetics, but again, we have identified over 100 combinations of hormones, gonads, genitalia, and chromosomes, suggesting that if we're going to say how many biological sexes are, you have to say at least three, possibly 100, because we've identified, again, over 100 combinations of different ways of putting things together. And does each one of those constitute a biological sex is a really cool question. And again, we need to always be asking questions and seeking out knowledge, and then discovering more questions as we come up with more knowledge, because that's just always how it goes. But again, this question, are gender and sexuality linked, is also a theme we're going to be discussing throughout this class. Because again, if your biology influences your identification with socially constructed gender categories, how does your biology also influence what you're attracted to? Because think about arousal. It's not just a thought, right? Arousal is a physical response. And your physical response to what attracts you is influenced by your DNA. And so, again, your DNA has it built into you what you kind of like and what you kind of don't like. And so, again, you're going to respond to some things more than other things, suggesting that, again, what we're attracted to isn't necessarily doesn't always line up with this binary social context system that we have lived in for the last 100 or 2 or 300 years or so, that is evolving in this modern times to look at gender as being fluid, to looking at sexuality as being fluid, and then I'm going further by saying biological sex also being fluid. So again, they're all kind of linked. It's hard to separate them out. And we're going to talk about this more when we look at the differences between males and females, and we'll ask that question, well, what really makes us different? Is it the body parts, or is it the way that we're raised and the way that we're treated in the social context? So again, are you aware of how sexuality is structured by others? This is important. You need to understand how the social context molds our behaviors and cognitions, so be keeping that in mind. Be thinking about how biological sex, gender, and sexuality may all be linked. And then again, be thinking about all the possible sexual behaviors and cognitions humans can engage in. And again, the book talks about, is there diversity of sexual expression in the world? What do you see? What are all the different types and ways that people engage in sexual behavior, cognitions, fantasies, whatever it might be? It's diverse. So again, diversity in human sexuality, there's a lot of it. So, one, do the interactions vary? There are people that are with one person their whole life. There are people that are with hundreds of people. There are people that are with one person at a time. There are with people that are with multiple people at a time. There are people that have relationships that are serial, like maybe they date for a year. There are people that have relationships where maybe they date for a week. There are family types of all kinds, same-sex couples, heterosexual couples, single parents, all engaging in diverse sexual behaviors. When you get into the dark side of, I don't want to label it stigmatic, but let's stigmatize it, the dark side of sexuality, and you start to look at things like sexual philias, there are people that will go after the elderly, that will go after children. Okay, there's gerontophilia and pedophilia, and the list goes on. I'll discuss that a little bit later in the chapter. But again, humans unchecked, without the social control, without the cultural norms and expectations, will engage in very diverse sexual behaviors, from masturbation to oral sex to animals. And again, you have to ask, why do we have laws? We need laws that regulate sexuality? And that's the answer is if you don't have laws, humans will engage in some of those behaviors as listed. However, we should always be asking, well, what laws have value and are relevant in modern times? So, for example, being gay and engaging in same sex behavior historically could have resulted in you being institutionalized or, even put to death for something along those lines. And now in modern times, we've since 1973 in psychology no longer label it as a disorder, but still bias is pervasive across the psychological field. So again, we need to be thinking about how much diversity in behavior and types in relationship types, like think about all the different relationships. Again, you have polyamorous relationships, monogamous relationships. And what's absolutely fascinating is, like, in my marriage and family book, chapter 1, it says polyamorous relationships were the most common throughout human history. That means being with more than one person was the most common throughout human history. And again, you have to ask why. You could look at evolutionary psychology arguments of like alpha males and testosterone and access to females and fighting off other mates and things along those lines. You can talk about forms of power, whatever it might be. But it's very interesting to think that, polyamorous relationships were the most common compared to monogamy. However, when you look at some psychological studies as to like what has the most brain benefits over time, you're going to find that monogamous relationships, for example, have a lot of brain rewards because not only do you fulfill your sexual needs, but you're also getting support and love and all kinds of other factors. And so, arguably, as long as you can be getting those things, any type of relationship, you'll still get the brain rewards that come from it. Now, we have to ask the really complex question: one, are men and women different? And are we different sexually? I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now because we have a whole chapter on this, but I'm just going to kind of give you some quick introduction to these concepts. When I went to get my PhD, that was what I studied for years. I asked, are men and women different? And if we are different, how does that influence our thoughts, cognitions, emotions, and behavior, right? Yes, we have divergent body parts, okay? Things like that are obvious. Yes, there are some subtle brain differences, but psychologists are quick to point out that behavior differences between sexes are really result from socializing each other differently, right? So even though we have some biological differences, male and female humans are not very different at all, regardless. And these subtle differences in our brain don't really make us that different. However, there are some arguments, right? So, like, why are men better at visual spatial skills on tests and women better at like emotional intelligence? Is that because we have as males more biological affinities to hold objects, and women have more biological affinities to engage in interpersonal relationships? Is the female part of the emotional brain more developed, their social part of the brain more developed than a male's? And there is some strong arguments. However, it's hard to separate out the nature from the nurture to ever know for sure. Because the way we raise women, do we not kind of push them more into those areas and focusing on those areas instead of being great at hitting baseballs or shooting basketballs, right? And so again, you have to look at the socialization of gender compared to biological influences upon behavior that could be divergent between the sexes. When it comes to sexual behavior, there are also differences. They're not huge differences, but like the sex cycle in itself, women tend to have a little bit more of a bell curve, whereas men tend to have more of like a linear line when it comes to being primed and ready for sex, for example. But again, we just aren't that different. Like, and teaching an introduction to psychology class in that book, it talks about, just biological differences like sexual arousal when you're sleeping. Like males tend to have erections for long periods of time while sleeping, but women tend to get wet during that time. And so, I mean, are we really that different? And then when you go out and study sexual behavior, if you look at frequency of sexuality, yes, men tend to have a little bit more. When you look at differences between gay men and lesbian men, a little bit more. How much of that is based upon biology and how much of that's just based on social context and learning? Again, that's the nature nurture. But we have to recognize that there are some subtle differences. And so we can't necessarily say that things are all equal across the board, meaning like our bodies work exactly the same, because that would be inaccurate. However, what is kind of unknown is the extent to which our bodies being different create different sexual arousal periods, feelings, emotions towards sex, desire. Psychology talks very heavy about things like mate selection. Are women more selective in who they choose to have sexual relationships with because a woman can only have like 12 to 13 babies in a lifetime, whereas a men are not selective because they can have multiple babies? But does that actually hold up in court? But then again, the male brain has responses after we have sex compared to a female brain, in that another neurotransmitter aside from like dopamine and oxytocin that create bonds is released after sexuality that makes men possessive, territorial of the person that they just had sexual relations with. And so again, it's super complicated. I'm going to pull up some research studies to really support this when we get to gender, because even for my own brain, I have studied this so much, but it's just so complicated, and you almost have to kind of look at it from like an evolutionary psychological theory, and then look at it from a cognitive psychological theory like thoughts, and then look at it from like a psychosocial theory, incorporating the social context in the way we behave, and then looking at a biosocial theory and blending the biology and this. So again, it's kind of easier to break it out like that, which we'll do. But again, hopefully this is just a quick introduction. Look at some brain differences between men and women. You can look at mate selection differences between men and women. You can look at sexual cycle differences between men and women. And then you can look at things like menopause and physical changes that occur over time. It's complicated, but again, that's why we're here, right? To break into this complicated stuff. Over here, I put the gingerbread person. I'm not a huge fan of the continuum theory of sexuality. I am, again, more of a sexual configurations theory person, where I don't really look at sexuality as something that ranges between gay and straight. But I don't really look at biological sex as something that really ranges between male and female, because it's so complicated. So again, the sexual configurations theory is more like, imagine a universe, and each galaxy is like part of your identity. They're not all connected with one line. They're all just kind of out there in space, but they are kind of connected by gravity as a whole. And then all of it is kind of pulling on each other, turning on the black holes in the centers of our galaxies. Sex and procreation. So your book starts to ask the question, what is the purpose of sex? And again, that's where you can take more of an evolutionary psychological approach to how we approach sexuality. One, why have we evolved to have sex in the first place? I had to answer this question. I had to go back to like sharks. When we initially split into male and female, and intersex is kind of that leftover from our hermaphroditic days. Because again, there's two ways to make babies. One, clone yourself. Two, blend genes, male and female, right? And so I had to go back deep into millions of years ago when we first split off to really get into, that. But again, procreation, the purpose is, again, to mix the genes, get genes from here and genes from here. Why have we evolved to get two sets of genes instead of one? The argument is Viability. Which babies are more viable? The ones that have diverse genetics or the one that all has the same genetics? Think about the potato famine in Ireland. The reason that happened was they were all growing the same type of potato. So one disease came and it wiped out that one type of potato, and that was it. Had they been planting a bunch of different potatoes, different genetics, that wouldn't have happened. They're all the same type of potato, but with enough genetic variation, they can fight off the diseases that are trying to hack them. And it's kind of that argument. So, why do we have sex in the first place? You could argue that the biological origin is that. But then, why have we evolved pleasure and reward and dopamine releases beyond procreation? Again, we can have sex past the viability of having babies and still enjoy it and still get rewards. Your brain has built it into you to seek rewards. It wants you to go out in the world and interact and do stuff. And so it rewards you when you eat, you feel good. When you have sex, you feel good. When you get a hug, you feel good. When you laugh, you feel good. Why do you have all these feelings in the first place? You have evolved over millions of years to have these feelings. One argument is to reward you to keep engaging in these types of behaviors. So, to say that the sole purpose of sex is procreation is absolutely limited, and that it doesn't consider that the brain is driving you to continue to engage in these types of behaviors long after viability of just procreating. Does our body and our brain want us to go out and do these things? Is a killer question. So again, the purpose of sex is completely arbitrary. It's decided by cultures or by you yourself. Okay? But there are some good biological arguments to support why we engage in this behavior in the first place. One, so we can mix different types of genetics to create, some viable offspring to pass on the genes or whatever the purpose of life is. And then two, to seek out the rewards because it makes us feel good. If you didn't have a reward when you had ice cream, you wouldn't keep eating ice cream. You keep eating ice cream because every time you eat ice cream, you feel good afterwards and you want that feeling again and again and again. I cannot stop going to Starbucks. I'm obsessed. So again, what are the social expectations attached to sex, though? Again, we keep talking that the social expectations attached to sex are set in our culture. You look to the cultural norms to know what's acceptable. And depending upon the time you live in and the culture you live in, that's what dictates what's acceptable, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But then you have to think about your individual expectations. And again, like I said, with the inner self and the social self, you have your own inner desires and feelings and emotions and things like that, wants. But then the society also has its own expectations about what you should do and what you should engage in. And we're all trying to find that line between the two, walk that line between our inner self and what we want and what we need and what's acceptable out here. Okay? Your book gets into other ideas too, like there are various methods of pleasure. Okay, so humans engage in masturbation, they engage in intercourse before marriage, intercourse with multiple partners, sex between same sex partners, all kinds of things. However, our attitudes toward these things have changed over time. I'm going to get that on the next slide, but I'm just setting you up that it's built into us to be able to have oral sex, masturbation, intercourse, sex with same sex, sex with different sex with all kinds of different people all at one time. It is built into us. We're sexual beings. But that's not even accurate because not all people are sexual beings. And so that's the other side of it that actually is probably a good, I'm surprised I haven't introduced this before now. But then there's the lacking attraction or not wanting sex side of it all too. So we always want to think about the idea of being asexual also. Again, hence my I don't like the continuum theory as much as I like sexual configurations theory. Because the continuum theory just assumes we're somewhere between straight and gay, but where is asexual on that? Is that in the middle of the linear line, or is that just a whole different galaxy also? And so again, we're built up for a lot of different potentials. Okay? Um, just real quick, set you up for the next slide. As attitudes have changed, again, it was illegal to have oral sex in 10 states in the United States until 2003 still. It was illegal until 2015 to have same sex marriage, for example. We have had some changes in our attitudes towards sex, which we're about to talk about. But again, just some quick questions like how do we define sex? What is sex? Is masturbation sex? Is just having an orgasm sex? Does sex require intercourse? Does it have to be penile and vagina intercourse, or can it be anal intercourse or oral intercourse? What counts? What constitutes it? Again, arbitrary. It's depending on how we're going to look at it. Um, yeah. So we'll leave that open for right now until we get to that section where we strictly define, what that's going to mean. But for now, I just want you thinking about some of the potentials. I put a picture of my daughter over here. I never sought out kids, but yet somehow I ended up with a bunch of kids. What up? Sex and gender roles. All right, so again, we're introducing a bunch of different concepts that we're going to be talking about throughout this class. Again, a whole different chapter on that, but since this is the first chapter in the book, we're introducing some of these ideas. When it comes to that social context, we also have to think about the fact is we socially constructed a society in which gender roles exist and people are socialized into gender roles, albeit we are more egalitarian in our attitudes toward gender roles than we used to be back in the day. Still, gender roles influence our attitudes and expectations about what's acceptable and what's not. So you need to be asking, what are gender roles? Gender roles are socially defined expectations about what's an appropriate behavior depending upon the gender category that you belong to, self-identify with, or are socially identified with. Then you need to ask how the gender you identify with and those social expectations shape your sexual expectations and society's expectations for you. So again, if you're born a boy, what is appropriate? How are you supposed to act? How many sex partners are you supposed to have? What's your script? Who's supposed to ask who out? Who's supposed to pay for dinner? And again, if you're a girl, do you have a different standard about what's sexually acceptable and what's not? Like the book discusses how men, it's more acceptable to have multiple partners, and then for females, not so much. And then it related that even intersectionally with ethnicity and said specifically in Hispanic cultures that you tend to see something like that a little bit more. Again, we've asked though, how are gender and biology linked? How much does our biological processes influences the gender categories that we identify with? But also even more complicated, how do biological processes infer the gender categories and those social norms that we attribute to that category? And again, if you have to hit back 10 seconds to replay what I just asked, that's even more complex. Because again, we're the ones who came up with gender categories, but these ideas about what we think people should do is that influenced by our biology. And so, a little bit, again, we're going to be talking about that more in the future. But again, our physiological differences, do they make us different? Do they make us want different things? Do they make us want to identify with different categories? And then, based upon the category you identify with or you are socially labeled as, how does that influence your sexual role and your relationship role? Who does what? Or are you just no roles? Because no, just doing what you want is egalitarian. Okay, traditional is like that whole men does this, women does this kind of thing. And as I said, we're kind of split right now. We still have those, persistent traditional gender roles, but we're also challenging gender roles continuously, and society is in flux, and Women are in the workforce just as much as men, and men are taking care of the babies 4 times more than they did 50 years ago. I mean, things are changing, gender roles are changing. So again, the questions like, do cultural expectations differ for each gender about what is socially defined as acceptable relating to your sexuality, sexual behavior, the roles you're playing, who's on top, who's on bottom, etc. You have to ask, how does this influence you? And then finally, to wrap this up, which we'll do a whole chapter on this, stigmas. How do we stigmatize you if you don't conform to the gender roles and the social expectations? Like historically, if you were a female, unmarried in the 1950s and you got pregnant, would you have been shunned? You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. And if you're a boy who's a virgin and you're 25, will they stigmatize you for not having had sex yet? That kind of stuff. Your book gets into concepts like slut shaming. It literally puts slut shaming in bold and defined it, which I was like, interesting. I didn't expect that. I've like referred to that in classes and I always thought it was kind of taboo to ask about that, but now that it's in a textbook, I guess we're good. But again, that idea that if a woman has sex with too many people, they shame you. And if a guy doesn't have sex with too many people, they shame you. So again, these differential expectations. I don't want to take too long on the history of sexuality just at this point because we're already pretty deep into this lecture, but this would be an excellent final project topic. Your book does not do this justice at all in chapter 1. It pretty much starts out with like Judaic and Christianity. It's very Western cultural specific. It is not encompassing of thousands of years of history across different cultures, different continents at all in the least. But again, if you go back far enough in history, every society at some time has people have engaged in homosexual behavior. From the Japanese to Alexander the Great having sex with his historian, all while conquering across the world. Yes, the world's greatest conqueror ever, who was way better than Napoleon, by the way, engaged in sexual relations with all types of different sexes. Just check it out, look it up. Okay, but again, it's like I was having this conversation the other day because I was trying to say somebody in modern times, like, kind of brought drag shows to the forefront or something like that. And I was getting schooled because they were like, dude, look at Shakespeare. I mean, all the Shakespearean actors were all dressing up in drag. Like, again, if you just go back at different times in history, you're going to find that people were engaging in stuff. What do you think the Romans were really doing in those baths? Okay. How many gay British kings have there been in history? Quite a few. And some scandals as a result, too. I mean, the English literally have killed people because, some guy was having sex with their king and they didn't like that man being too close to them. So again, it's just it's in the potential for homosexual behavior and all the other sexual behaviors is in our DNA. And so, but again, how much of the behaviors we go and do are influenced by innate, even ideas like, I'm not to say that we have innate morality is way pushing it, and I'm not suggesting that, but at the same time, we do have these kind of predetermined smiles and being nice and happy and laughing, just like we have the ability to be very violent and kill people and engage in genocide. Like, if you're going to go just look at the FBI statistics of how many crimes and types of crimes are committed every year, and you can see what humans are capable of, okay? So I do challenge you to take a deep dive into sexual norms, cultural attitudes to sexuality and divergent types of sexuality across all of time. Because you're going to find that it's like this, it ebbs and it flows, it ebbs and it flows. Your book gets into kind of a short period of how it ebbs and flows. It starts talking about early on, like let's just go with 0 AD. Judaic and Christian traditions. Again, it's very Western cultural centered for this section of the book. You had these rigid gender roles where men's roles were to do this, expectations are this, women's were over here. And in the early days, they had an appreciation of sexuality when married. But then there was a big pushback. Paradoxically, this idea that we need to overcome the needs of the flesh. And so your book talks about St. Augustine around 300s, 400s, where sex begins to be seen as sinful. And that sex is seen as the original sin. The Adam and Eve having sex was the initial downfall of humanity. And then this is also around the time where they start pushing this idea that women should submit to men. And this idea that women were the original sin because women seduced Adam led to this antagonism of women, which still persists today. You could totally make some interesting arguments about how women being portrayed as the seducers of men that led to us being sinners as human. Like, there's a lot to that. I'm going to talk about that in a second when it comes to black women. Same thing happened to them, more specifically. But around this time, 400, you start to see things like celibacy being seen as superior to marriage, almost a putting down of sexual relations. Sex should only be for procreation. And it's about this time, and I had to quote your book so you know where I'm bringing this up from. It's not just my stuff, this is just research. This is one's from your book. Men on top was the only, quote, natural position for sex, a necessary but religiously denigrated act. And so look on page 11 of your books of Crooks I Tell 2021 to see where I was pulling that out. Then during the Renaissance, we start to open up a little bit. Traditional attitudes are still pervasive. And then by the time Martin Luther comes around in the 1500s, we kind of go back to those original Judaic Christian original ideas that, stress isn't actually evil. As long as you're married, it relieves stress, it creates bonds with the people. And during this time, women start to participate in society again. But then come the 1800s in the Victorian area, and we go back to these Augustine 300s and 400s attitudes about rigid gender roles, having self restraint with sexuality. And then your book goes on a rant here because then it introduces slavery during the Victorian age. And it starts talking about why black women were more likely and still are more likely to be raped than white women. And this gets into white women's purity was held to a higher standard than black women's purity. Black women were portrayed as, the book says, book's word, this is your book's word, Jezebels, defined in by your book as a seductress with an insatiable sexual appetite. White men labeled black women derogatively to justify them raping them. It is absolutely horrible. And then on the flip side, I had to quote your book again here, is this idea that black men were then stereotyped as being highly fertile, larger than white-sized penises, and white men feared them. Straight out of your book. So again, this fear of white men or this insecurity of white men toward black men. I mean, does this go back to times of slavery? Please read that section of your book so you know where I'm coming from. It's just really dark, but again, if you look at the rape of slave women and the justifications for that and the dehumanizing of them, and then white men would basically say, it's the black women. They were seducing me because going back to the original sin. Awful. The lynching of black men, again, white men being afraid and insecure. Why else would they be lynched? The number one reason a black man was lynched historically was being uppity. And in uppity is talked about in my race and ethnicity book. Uppity means being confident. So if a black man was confident walking down the street, they would just lynch them. And then black women still continue to be raped more than white women because, again, these persistent prejudices influence people's cognitions. The fact that humans rape at all is going to be a really hard, tough conversation in this. But again, the higher rates for black women is utterly sad. Then in modern times, late 1800s, going into the 1900s, you start having the psychology of sexuality starts to bloom. You start to get into Freud's psychosexual theories. You start to get the challenging of gender roles. I put in here, your book was talking about the flapper girls, the shedding restraint of the flappers. You know, for like a woman to smoke a cigarette in this time was like a huge deal because a woman couldn't smoke. And so the flapper girls were just so proud to have their cigarettes and flaunt it. But again, you start to see changes in sexual behavior during this time. You start to see more public displays of affection. The book talks about kissing and how kissing in public was like this radical shift. You know, in modern times, we would kind of scoff at that, like whatever. But then World War II comes and that ends, and we go back to this rigid gender role system. And then all the psychologists are all like, women just have penis envy, they want to go out and be men, and there's some ridiculous psychology there. I'm making jokes now. There's good psychology in the 50s and 60s. Again, we could apply behaviorist theory and look at learning theories of stimulus and response and classical conditioning and operant conditioning to understand our sexuality. We can look at Bandura's social observational theories to understand how we look in the social context, to understand how we're supposed to behave, right? But there's also some of that silliness, like, the penis envy theory kind of stuff, but whatever. Your book talks about it, so I just threw it in there just as a little bit of a joke. But then again, the 60s, you start to see a big rebellion. Women start to reject the 1950s rigid gender roles. They want access to the workplace. They want to become doctors and lawyers. They don't want to be restricted by their husbands and their fathers and all the other men on the planet. They don't want oppression. They want equal pay, and they want freedom from violence. They want freedom from sexual and physical violence. Your book talks about the Kinsey study in 1948, which we talked about in when we talked about measuring sexuality. But again, the Kinsey study again is a major study that really opened the doors to look, people are engaging in all kinds of sexual acts. Kinsey studied men and women, and people were particularly shocked about women because they hadn't really heard I guess the mass public, the populists, hadn't really heard about all kinds of fun stuff that women were getting, into during that time. And so they were a little bit shocked about all the various behaviors. But again, you're human. What does it mean to be human? Is being sexual part of that? 1972, they legalized contraception for all. Um, since the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you're starting to see lots of taboos be challenged, like same sex marriage, having sex before marriage, things along those lines. And then in the 1990s, what was once taboo becomes more mainstream, like seeing a gay couple on TV, for example, or having a girl before she's married be out in the city and engaging in sexual relationships and with multiple people and all kinds of different boyfriends and girlfriends. Just to kind of conclude, your book, again, just to get you thinking about the social context influences, you have to be thinking about institutions in the social context that structure your sexual behavior, your sexual identity, your expectations about what you think is acceptable, things along those lines. So be thinking about how family structures your attitudes. Be thinking about how the education system structures your attitudes and your behaviors. Be thinking about how things like the media influences your attitudes. And I put up these cosmopolitan magazines because, again, you have to think about things like body image and what is sexy and how is that portrayed? How are sex scenes portrayed? Okay, so again, what are the influence of social institutions such as the TV, advertising, social media, magazines, online videos upon our sexual behavior, sexual norms, and things along those lines? And so again, how is sexuality portrayed now compared to modern times. Like in the 1950s, to portray a woman having an orgasm on TV was really, really taboo. Like a female having an orgasm in a movie was so taboo. But nowadays, you have Friends where Monica's screaming 7, 7, 7. Watch the Friends episode. That's the 1990s, talking about sex on TV openly. Did that challenge social norms, or was it just kind of normal by the time the 90s came around? How is sexual violence and risky behavior portrayed? I remember watching a movie called Kids when I was young, and it's about AIDS, and it's about like inner city New York kids in the 90s when the city was a lot more rough, and the spreading of the viruses amongst this friend group. And man, that movie always got to me. It's still in my head a little bit. Um, Sex education materials. Look at how that has changed over time, but also look at how sex education materials can be used for good, right? Because if you don't know, you're not informed, does that increase STDs, STIs? Does that increase the likelihood of pregnancy that's unwanted, for example? Things to think about. And then again, internet dating, which again, we'll talk about relationships and things coming up in the future, but how has media and sexuality, how has it changed over time, just in the way that we meet people and introduce ourselves to people? So again, we need to be looking at the past, in the current, and the future. So I put past, present, and future, even though past and current controversies is the heading that the book talked about. But again, think about social policies, laws, ethics, attitudes, social norms, culture. How has that changed over time? And then just to finish it out, historically, like in marriage and family, marriages were more economic, right? It was an exchange, for some kind of economic gain in some way or another. But then around the 1700s, industrial revolution, especially urbanization, people were no longer tied to the land. Their marriages didn't solidify who was going to get what. And so this cool idea that is almost a relatively new invention, you could say, is this idea of marrying for love, or dating for love, or having sex for love. And it's a cool idea. And so that would also be a good final topic. When did marrying for love or dating for love become a thing? And how has that changed or evolved our relationships? And then you could finish that out with conversations like divorce or breaking up. What happens when you fall out of love? Or what happens if people are in love their whole life and you have all these great qualitative happy stories of love? Or all these miserable, horrible stories about how they wish they had broken up with that person and gotten with somebody else, but yet they stayed together. I'm sure you'd have a blend of all of the above. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.